and online for the special Majlis of my dear friend and colleague Andrew Marsham, who is sitting. You will see him in a different picture, but he's actually sitting 1 meter and 30 centimeters away from me to the left. That's why I'm doing this. And I met Andrew first on paper with a very, very dear friend of mine who was trapped and cut into pieces and put into an oven. Luckily, it was not Andrew, but Andrew and Chase Robinson found out that the text, which is a supremely interesting text, which caused probably his death, well, it still exists. It was a very well-known text, but it was never studied and never digged out, and so that's how I first met him. I mean, Andrew. And that's a brilliant piece of scholarship. And then I invited him to our conference on legitimate and illegitimate violence, which was Rob Gleave's project, and which was the project that brought me here to Exeter. And so, and that okay, let's hope I can manage. No, it doesn't want. Yeah. So this is the book, the first volume of it. Because it doesn't want it. It's why. Is there a way to? Okay. So this is it, and so we had the conference, and then Andrew gave a brilliant paper, which was published in the volume, and it's right after my paper. And my paper is about the devil, rebelling devil, and his one is about burning heretics. So it shows again we like to play with fire, both of us, in scholarship at least. So it's and since then we talked. And also, I wanted to say, editing someone's work in your volume is a really good way to know the other. I learned a lot of things of people which I would have preferred not to know, but Andrew is not one of them. Andrew was really a joy to work with, and his scholarship was. I admired his scholarship and his love for accuracy and detail, and it's exemplary. And then we were in contact about several students whom we had, and then they became his students. And now I have the delight to have him beside me and after me right now, talking about himself and then about the topic about the Umayyad. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much indeed, Istvan, for that very warm introduction. It's really nice to be back in Exeter. I think it is 12 years since I was here, which is shocking, but it's very good to see you in person again. Thank you everybody for joining the talk here and online. I understand that the convention with these talks is to spend a little bit of time talking about how I came to be working on the things I work on from a sort of biographical point of view. I have to say that's very uncomfortable. But I thought of a few things that maybe I could talk about. And then I will move to talk about the Umayyad Empire. I will aim for about 55 minutes, if that's okay. Okay.
So when my little daughter is performing today, she's 9 and she's playing her piano piece, and I told her when you will be playing, don't think about you playing, think about the beautiful piece and that you want to transmit this. That works usually for me. So, well, Andrew is in the unfortunate situation that the beautiful piece he's talking about is himself, and this doesn't have. But if you just focus on what you want to transmit to us from your life, then it's not you, but the literary persona.
Thanks, Istvan. That helps. I will share my screen. Does that work? Good. I'll come to this in a minute. I'll start with the bio stuff. I guess one of the things I think I've learned from doing history is that it is all about accidents of birth and location and time. Definitely it's the same is true for me as for everybody else. The pathway to early Islamic history went through school and an interest in history and languages, which is what I did at A level in Bath, not very far from Exeter, it has to be said. And from there, I went to Oxford to study history, so-called modern history, which is history after the reign of Diocletian in Oxford. And I was very fortunate that in Oxford in the mid-1990s, which is when I was there as an undergraduate, there was a kind of critical mass of people doing very interesting stuff on late antiquity, broadly defined. There was a real synergy between different faculties, which is often not the case in universities. But in Oxford, there was a lot of interaction between Byzantinists, historians, Byzantinists in classics, Byzantinists in history, other medieval historians, and people working in what was then the Oriental Institute, now the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, which made Oxford an exciting place to be. And I think I was drawn towards the Middle East partly by the atmosphere at the time, by a bit of a dissatisfaction about the mismatch between the curriculum at Oxford, which was very Britain and Europe, with a bit of America, and the experience of living in the globalizing world of the 1990s, of the Salman Rushdie Satanic Verses affair in Britain, which had just happened when I went to university. And I think these are some of the things that drew me towards a more global perspective on history and made me attracted to these topics on the Middle East originally. I thought I could talk about the bio through some books, books that I sort of really remember having an impact on me, and teachers that had an impact on me along the way. I want to advance my slides. Why do they not advance? Let's try that. There we are. The first time I came across Islamic history really was through Brian Ward Perkins. He's a medieval historian, an archaeologist at Oxford, and he set me to read the first edition, I think, of Hugh Kennedy's The Prophet and the Age of the Caliphate. So one of my essays. I remember that's when I first heard about Umayyads a long time ago. The other book that really shapes what was going on in Oxford with respect to late antiquity is, of course, Peter Brown's World of Late Antiquity, which I also read somewhere along the way. And it should be said, Garth Fowden's Empire to Commonwealth, which in some ways builds on things that Peter Brown was doing. And it was these things that took me to do a master's degree in the Oriental Institute. So I moved from history to Oriental Studies, and I was fortunate that I did a 2-year master's degree, which was a rare beast then. It's even rarer now, which let me do a lot of Arabic study alongside the study of the history of the Middle East. That's when I met Chase Robinson, who became my PhD supervisor, DPhil supervisor, I should say. And the books that sort of stick in my mind from that phase and into the PhD, these are somewhat random, arbitrary choices, but they are things that I remember making a big impression. Slaves on Horses by Patricia Kroner, and indeed Kroner's work more generally, was very influential and much debated at this point in the 1990s, early 2000s. This book in particular really alerted me to the potential of thinking prosopographically about Islamic history. I think it is a brilliant kind of pointer to one of the things you can do with the early Islamic historical tradition, which is rare in medieval history. Also, it's a pointer to thinking sociologically about how societies work, which is something Kroner was very interested in. She had a kind of social scientific view of history. I found that extremely helpful. Roy Motahode had been Chase Robinson's supervisor. And he is famous for many publications, but this one, Loyalty and Leadership, drew my attention to social anthropology and history, and how you could borrow from anthropology to think about pre-modern societies. And this is a brilliant book about political culture in early Islam. And it was in many ways, it was the jumping off point for what I did in my DPhil, thinking about pledges of allegiance. And then Chase Robinson's Empire and Elites, I suppose he was writing this while I was doing my master's degree. But it indicates the sorts of things that I got from Chase. And I think in particular with Chase, it was close attention to the texts and movement between sort of positivist questions and historiographic ones, and the historiography in particular, something that I took from Chase. He's also very inspired by social scientific approaches to the past. And the last sort of cluster of books that I think point to things that I learned from people I met while I was doing my DPhil are these ones. Beit al-Maqdis, this was edited by Jeremy Johns and Julian Raby. And already as an undergraduate, I'd been very attracted to archaeology as a discipline that allowed you a very different kind of access to the past and allowed you to ask all kinds of questions that the surviving textual evidence often doesn't help you with. And I really vividly remember Jeremy's and Julian's lectures at the Oriental Institute. They were really helpful. Nadia Jamil was writing this book, I suppose, when I was doing my DPhil, but it's her PhD, her DPhil. And I learned a lot of what Arabic I've learned from Nadia, and got a real sense of the potential of the literary Arabic tradition as a historical source, as well as a literary canon. And finally, James Howard Johnston. This is a recent book that he published, but the themes are things that he's been working on for a long time. And he and his student Mark Whittow, they conveyed the importance of geography in historical thinking, and again, historiography, and the potential to think geopolitically about pre-modern societies, and to take the political actors and military actors of pre-modern society seriously as strategists. That's some of the things that I took from being very lucky to work in an environment where these people were teaching and researching. And so I was, by this point, glad that I'd gone into Arabic history and Oriental studies. I knew that what I really needed to do was develop my Arabic. And I did that through the 2-year masters and then a year out before my DPhil. And I spent my summers and then my year out in Damascus, in Syria, which is the other really big impact or big influence, I think, on where my work went. subsequently. I really fell in love with Syria, and I'm still in touch with friends that I met there. Very sadly, I've not been back physically to Syria for 13 years or so now. But like a lot of students of Arabic in the 90s and 2000s, I lived in Barb in the old city, and spent a lot of time at the Umayyad Mosque, which is depicted in this photo. And from there, from this Masters and DPhil, I was fortunate to go to postdoc positions and then to become a lecturer. And was working on things like heretics in the Umayyad period, as Istvan said earlier on. That brings me to the topic. The Umayyad Mosque brings me to the topic of the talk, the Umayyads.
Just I interrupt just for a second. No one did that so far, going through books. So there is always something new in how people introduce themselves. I think it's really a very good lesson in itself what to read. And then Hugh Kennedy was mentioned, and we had a Majlis with Hugh, so you can watch it if you haven't seen it so far. And I think Garth is here, Garth Foden, and he has been invited, and at some point he will come. So yes, come to the Majlis.
Thank you. So let's move to the Umayyad Empire. This talk emerges from the book that I recently published on the Umayyad Empire with Edinburgh University Press. It's quite difficult to know how to talk about a book in 45 minutes. But what I thought I would do is draw out a few of the main things that have really struck me about the Umayyad Empire as a consequence of researching and writing the book. I'll start with a short overview of the Umayyad Empire, which is probably redundant for many people. Let's see. Paying attention to its distinctive characteristics as a tributary empire, conquered by pastoralists, but led for the most part by settled tribespeople, which is an unusual combination. And the center-periphery conflict that is, I know this is an old-fashioned label, but I think it's still useful. The center-periphery conflict that is arguably typical of tributary empires has some unique consequences for state formation and identity formation in the empire. Then I'll turn to three things that struck me as particularly important for understanding Umayyad history. Firstly, the role of ecology in history. Secondly, the character of relations between the Umayyad elite and the pastoralist tribes of the Syrian desert. And here I should acknowledge Elizabeth Keyfowden, whose work, The Barbarian Plain, I found extremely insightful on why the Syrian desert matters so much in the Umayyad period. And thirdly, the development of new ethnic and religious identities in the context of empire formation. So there are 4 bits to the talk. I'll start with the narrative that I just mentioned. This is my favorite graph from the beginning of the book. It is published by Janken Myrdal in 2012, and it plots by just counting squares on the map the size of empires over the last 5,000 years. You can argue a lot with the detail, but the basic idea is powerful, I think. He's derived it from data that was initially plotted by Rein Targapera, who's a quantitative historian from the 1970s. And he tweaked it a bit. So the black line is the single largest empire at any given point, and the grey line is the cumulative size of the 3 largest empires at any given point. The y-axis is logarithmic, so the graph is squashed, right? In other words, the step changes that happen around 500-600 BC and around 1400, 1500 AD, those step changes are much bigger than the graph initially suggests. It's millions of megameters squared on the left, and you can see that it's logarithmic. So small bumps are actually quite big spikes. And it's the 5,000 years of history from Pharaonic Egypt through to nearly modern times. And the late Umayyad Empire I've plotted on the graph, and it is a notable spike. It illustrates how distinctive an event the formation of the Umayyad Empire is in world. It was the largest pre-modern empire in terms of land area and large in terms of population too, until the era of the Mongol conquests, which is the next big spike that you see in the 13th and 14th centuries. And as with the Central Asian empires, nomadic pastoralists are the main source of military force that brought the Umayyad Empire about. That explains the spikes. But whereas the Central Asian steppes have produced many such conquest empires, pastoralist empires, the Arabian Peninsula has only done this once in the Umayyad era. Moreover, the Umayyad Empire simultaneously brought about the formation of a new religious tradition, which arguably also makes it unique in world history. And these exceptional characteristics are because of a particular concatenation of circumstances, long-term change among the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula over many centuries, and a shorter-term crisis from James Howard Johnston in the power balance of the region. And the short-term crisis is what allows for the formation of a new Arabian military elite and their extensive conquests. That's the proximate cause, right? This new elite articulated their shared identity with reference to the ambient discourse of Judeo-Christian religion and biblical definitions of ethnicity, as did their rivals in the same space. And it's now clear that these ethnic and religious discourses were already prevalent in late antique Arabia, making the career of the Prophet Muhammad in many respects the midpoint of a process of change, of ethnic and religious formation, rather than the beginning or indeed the end of the process. You can think about him in the middle, I think. While the crisis in Roman and Sasanian military power allowed new Arabian formations to replace the old military elites, the nomadic pastoralist background of many of the Arabians and their allies from the Syrian desert gave them exceptional strategic mobility, not unlike the Central Asian nomads. So they had long lines of communication, they had agile and devolved power structures, and these are key factors in the exceptional scale of their empire. And they help to explain both its expansive, diverse organization and also the limits of Arabian fiscal and military power. The Umayyad Empire is it's worth asking still, is the Umayyad Empire an empire at all? Actually, it certainly isn't a bounded political entity like many of the maps that you see in textbooks, including, I have to say, my own Umayyad Empire book. It's a nodal network for much of its expanse. But I would maintain that empire is still a valid designation, certainly for the Marwanid Umayyad era. So that's the period 692 to 750. The Umayyad period has a history of near continual contention and turmoil. But it's also very evidently a period of state formation, which is inextricably connected to that turmoil, in fact. The two things are two sides of the same coin. Because the processes of military expansion and the appropriation of resources from the wealthiest regions of the Middle East generated repeated conflicts within the new military elite, which in turn led to the formation and consolidation of imperial structures, because as people struggled for power, they reorganized to outflank their rivals. It's in this cycle of, what we find is a cycle of conquests of imperial centers by their frontiers, which transform those frontiers into new centers, causing further waves of conflict between the new centers and the new frontier zones. This is the core periphery thing. With each wave of internal conflict, more centralized structures of power developed. And indeed, in this cycle of conquest of centers by frontiers, we can include the very first formation of the Arabian monotheist movement, because this too began in a frontier zone between the two empires in the Hijaz, the very remote Hijaz, and in its wider environs, including the Syrian desert. So, with the collapse in the early 7th century of Himyar and Sasanian Iran, and the defeat of the Romans, new frontiers are created in the settled lands to which the Arabians had formerly been peripheral. And this is the context in which the Quraysh of Mecca successfully transmuted their pre-existing status as local, sort of local aristocracy, a religious aristocracy in Mecca, into a new status both as trans-regional religious aristocrats and as leaders of the conquest movement. And the specific success of the Umayyads, the Umayyad clan of Quraysh, in the 640s and 50s is also connected to this frontier dynamic. The Umayyad second cousins, Othman in Medina and Muawiyah in Syria, both formed close associations with the pastoralists of the Syrian desert, the inhabitants of what had been the frontier zone between Rome and Iran. And resentment at the concentration of power in the hands of Othman's kin group and their allies famously triggered the three-way warfare between the Medinan center, the frontier in Iraq, and the Syrian frontier in the First Civil War, in which, of course, the Syrians emerged victorious under Muawiyah. And Muawiyah's accession precipitated an acceleration of war with the Roman Empire, in the Mediterranean in particular. And so this was the impulse for the consolidation of administrative power in Egypt and Syria. It's very clear that Muawiyah and his allies worked very hard to build a fleet, to develop the infrastructure of empire in order to confront the Roman Empire and to secure their position vis-a-vis the other Arabian conquerors. They also extend at this point their influence into the Caucasus, which becomes very important for later Umayyad history. At the same time, Muawiyah makes an alliance with one of his former rivals' allies in Iraq to protect his eastern flank. And then further conflict between rival elements within Quraysh and between Iraq and Syria brought about the accession of Muawiyah's Marwanid cousins and the further intensification of state building in the central lands of the empire. And I think it's clear that Egypt, Syria, the Caucasus, and the Hijaz is a sort of axis for the Umayyad clan, and Himyar, actually South Arabia, Yemen, an axis for the Umayyad clan, where they tend to be to have really secure control. The rest of the empire is more complicated. And commanders affiliated to the Marwanids waged war in North Africa and Iran, the Western Mediterranean, Central Asia, expanding the fiscal reach of the Umayyads and their allies across an 8,000-kilometer wide belt of territory, 5,000 miles wide. Hence the spike in Myrdel's graph. The failure of the Umayyads to capture Constantinople in 717 to 18, and then their defeats at Akroinon and Syracuse, which was another serious attempt on Constantinople, each coincided with phases of dynastic instability in the Umayyad ruling elite. So we get another graph. And this is a graph of lifespans of Umayyad caliphs. with the hashed stuff being the pre-caliph life and the black bit being when they reigned. And because of the way that patrimonial succession worked, the Umayyads had, well, that contributed anyway to a problem with short caliphates, short reigns. The 715 to 24 phase, you can see a phase of short reigns there, looks like dynastic bad luck for the most part. You have a run of caliphs who died in their 40s, 30s or 40s, of natural causes. That happens to coincide with the failure of the siege on Constantinople, which is disastrous, I think, for the Umayyad clan. That combination does them a lot of damage, their prestige and control, a lot of damage. The second band of short caliphates is self-inflicted and is a function of competition within what is now a very large Umayyad elite. The third fitna, a third civil war, really, and one of the contexts that helps to explain the collapse of Umayyad power. And that second phase of short caliphates is caused by the political destabilization that is triggered by Hisham's failure in 740 at Akroinon. And the wars of the 740s, the civil war of the 740s, can be seen as another three-way conflict, but this time between the western and eastern frontiers of the empire and the northern frontier, with the northern frontier backing the last Umayyad caliph in Armenia and Mesopotamia, and Berber and Khorasanian formations opposing him in the east and the west. In each region, west and east, in fact, in all three regions, non-Arab local military elites were major actors. And this is a consequence of the formation in previous decades of alliances with non-Arabian groups in these frontier spaces, often spaces just beyond the old Roman and Sasanian frontiers. And this crisis, of course, ended Umayyad rule in 750, or Umayyad imperial rule. So, the Umayyad century is a unique phase in world history where a new Arabian military federation took charge of a huge swathe of Roman and Sasanian territory and then points beyond it in east and west. And they generated dynamics of recurrent and frequent intra-elite competition. As militarized frontier peoples were drawn into the empire, they adopted and in turn adapted much of the religious and political culture of the new ruling elite. And then they took power over it. And that first happens with the Romano-Syrians, with Muawiyah, and then the so-called Berbers in North Africa, and the Khorasanians of eastern Iran in the 740s and 50s. And these latter two groups respectively established the classical Islamic power structures of the Emirates of North Africa and of the Abbasid Caliphate, respectively. Oh, sorry, that's one slide too far along. The remainder of the talk, I want to talk about these three elements in more detail: the environment, pastoralism, and identity. And I'll start with the environment. The environmental history of this period is a highly dynamic subject where lots of new studies are coming out all the time. I'm also not an environmental scientist nor a proper archaeologist. So I'm very apprehensive, given some of the people in the room. But this is a kind of generalist's attempt at some synthesis and general observations on what happens in this period. When thinking about the environment, it's worth noting that the conquests have significant environmental impacts themselves. Hugh Kennedy, who's been mentioned twice already, has shown that elite practices of distributing land grants led to the expansion of agricultural activity in tandem with urban expansion. And this is a really dramatic takeoff point in the history of Middle Eastern urbanism that Hugh Kennedy has pointed to the causes for. Another big environmental change is the movement of animals. And I think that there's some interesting work by Paul Wordsworth and others on this question of the introduction of camels and water buffalo into deserts and steppes and wetlands respectively, in this period. And again, it's connected to elite landholding and military movements. The Islamic green revolution in crops is not unrelated to the animal thing. And again, there's a huge literature that's moving very fast now that several groups are sort of revisiting the question of the green revolution. But what I want to look at now are the meteorological and ecological contexts of the conquests, the way that the environment impacted human beings rather than human beings impacting the environment. And the long-term or the longer term context for the formation of the Umayyad Empire is the late antique Little Ice Age, this is a graph from Wikipedia, but it's based on decent data for global average temperatures. The band on the left is the late antique Little Ice Age. If you look at the lowest temperatures, they are surprisingly low. There are some very low spikes in the 540s and 50s, and again in the early 700s. And the whole period, 540 to 750, is significantly cooler than the previous period, as far as we can see. It is worth saying that this is a tiny fluctuation compared to what we're doing now, which is the right of the graph. That's our self-inflicted problem. But it's interesting that the tiny fluctuation in a pre-modern context does seem to have had significant impacts on all kinds of aspects of society in the 6th and 7th centuries. This very cool phase famously coincides with the so-called Justinianic Plague, which begins in 542 or thereabouts as well. And that spreads through the Mediterranean and the Middle East, and then remains present down to about 750, actually, around the same time as the end of the Umayyads. There's again a huge literature on the plague. I think post-COVID, people have realized that the plague probably really mattered. And I think, there are various ways in which it could impact society. Probably the cooler conditions are not unrelated to the spread of the plague. Also, escalating war between Rome and Iran. Other historical periods show that when you have military conflict, this often leads to the spread of transmissible disease. Plague may well have had a disproportionate impact on the densest urban settlements and less impact in the deserts and steppes, which might contribute to the context for the formation of the empire. Certainly after the conquests of the 630s, the Arabian conquerors often seem to have presided over territories where there was a shortage of agricultural labor and where they were struggling to raise revenue. In Egypt and Iraq, where the documentary and narrative sources are the best, these shortages are clearly exacerbated by the pressures of taxation, which drove people away from agricultural and other labor. Besides the Ice Age, other aspects of the climate and any other relationship to historical events are less well understood. But I'd like to make two quick observations about two of the main weather systems that affected the lands of the Umayyad Empire. The first are the westerlies that track eastwards across the Mediterranean and influence the Tigris and the Euphrates. The second is the West African monsoon, which influences the Nile. The Atlantic westerlies have impacts on precipitation far into the Fertile Crescent and into the Middle East, affecting rainfall on the Zagros and the Alborz of Western Iran, for example. It looks as though the North Atlantic Oscillation, which affects these westerlies, flipped after about 550. So the pressure difference in the North Atlantic strengthened. This led to lower rainfall in the Mediterranean from about 600, and then it stabilizes down to about 750. So probably North Africa and the Levant were cooler and drier than usual in the 7th century. Concomitantly, the Tigris and the Euphrates were probably relatively high in this period. The West African monsoon There is strong evidence from Nile flood level records and from paleoclimatic evidence that the West African monsoon was relatively weak and erratic in the Umayyad period in the 7th and 8th centuries, or late 7th and 8th centuries into the 9th. The Nile flood was very unpredictable and extremely low compared to other averages in the 8th century in particular. And these low levels are reflected in the memory of dearths and famines in the literary sources. So these are the two very low phases of the Nile in the 8th century to the 9th. Overall, the environmental evidence suggests that the late 6th, 7th, early 8th centuries were unusually unsettled, with the late antique Little Ice Age contributing to the endemic presence of plague and concomitant agricultural shortages. Dry conditions pertained in the southern and eastern Mediterranean, perhaps contributing to an expansion of pastoralist activity into formerly agrarian spaces. At the same time, the Nile floods were increasingly uneven and sometimes failed, triggering dearths and unrest in Egypt, and putting pressure on the Umayyad taxation system because Egypt was the main taxation resource for the Umayyads of Syria. And this disturbed environmental context also helps to explain the exceptional political instability across the whole of Eurasia in the 6th and 7th centuries, which was exploited very successfully by the Quraysh and their Arabian pastoralist allies, but then also helps to explain why they sometimes struggled afterwards to maintain power. That brings me to the second theme, the success of the Arabian pastoralists, and particularly the tribes of the Syrian desert. The center of gravity of the Umayyad Empire, as it were, is much further south than the old Roman and Sasanian imperial system. The Arabians failed for the most part to move into the northern Mediterranean, while they extended their direct control much further south than the Romans and the Iranians, into Yemen and Oman, and southeast into Sind, and south into the Sahara. And the Arabian settlements of the Umayyad era are usually on the edges of the arid zones, controlling the riverine systems that interrupted it in Egypt, Iraq, Sistan, Khorasan, and Sind, or they're on the edges of fertile higher ground in Khorasan, Mesopotamia, the Levant, Yemen, and North Africa. That is, the conquests followed corridors of subtropical steppe, where the nomadic pastoralist armies operated most easily, and they followed these corridors to target regions of dense settlement and high agricultural surplus, as well as to aim for nodal points for high-value commerce, which suited their purposes as tribute-seeking conquerors. Moreover, the dominant military elite of the Umayyad era were drawn from one of the largest continuous steppe zones in the whole region, the Syrian desert. This is a photo from the mid-20th century of a bit of the Syrian desert, quite typical of a big funnel of space that stretches between the Sinai Peninsula in the south and eastern Turkey in the north. And until the mid-20th century, nomadic pastoralists moved seasonally between the drier areas of the steppe and better watered ones, moving into the arid zone in the autumn and returning to terrain with higher rainfall in the spring. This geography led to regular interactions between pastoralists and settled peoples in the zone between the 200 millimeter and the 400 millimeter isohyates, which are the two dotted lines on this map, and the little plants are the steppe, the Syrian steppe. And routes also led south into the deeper Syrian desert and into the Arabian Peninsula. And these marginal lands were at their most densely settled before modern times in the mid-6th century. The archaeological evidence tends to suggest a very high density of settled population in the Levant, around 500 plus. And then after the 540s, the Little Ice Age and the Justinianic Plague probably impacted the Syrian settled populations more than the pastoralists, rebalancing relations in favor of the latter. Some archaeologists now date these changes to a few decades later in the early 7th century, but the earlier date seems more plausible to me, the mid-6th century date. In the early 600s, the tribal group known as the Banu Kelb was said to have been the dominant group at Dumat al-Jandal, which is marked on the map there. And it seems also in some of the other places in the Syrian steppe. The rest of the southern and central steppe was controlled by various groups who may already have thought of themselves as part of a wider federation of Qadar, but it seems likely to me that this Qadar federation is a product of the conquests rather than something that preceded them. The Arabians seem to have made sure that the Banu Kelb didn't side with the Romans. And then bringing the Arabic-speaking tribes of the steppe into alliance concentrated exceptional military force in the hands of the Umayyad leaders, Yazid ibn Abi Sufyan and his allies. And these bonds are consolidated by marriage alliances. So Muawiyah famously married 2 women from the Banu Kelb, and they're part of a wider pattern of Marwanid marriage, or Umayyad marriage, I should say, into the Banu Kelb. So Uthman, Sa'id ibn al-As, Marwan I, Omar II, they all have Kelbi partners. These suggest that the wider Umayyad clan were very conscious of the military and political importance of the tribes of the Syrian desert, both for competition between the Umayyads and also non-Umayyad Meccan rivals, but also for competition also competition with other Umayyads. The kin connections between the various branches of Kelb do look to me distant enough from the era of the conquests to be political fictions from around the time of the conquests. It does raise the possibility that the Banu Kelb themselves are a product in many ways of the conquest phase, the formation of an elite Kelbi group. With the accession of Othman to the leadership of the new polity in 644 comes much closer coordination between the commanders in the provinces and the centre, based on kinship ties, close kinship ties. Muawiyah in Syria was unique among the main provincial commanders for not being removed and replaced by Othman. And this is probably because Muawiyah was too powerful for Othman to remove, with his ties to the tribes of the Syrian desert, as well as too important an ally because of those tribes. The Kelb backed Muawiyah's son, Yazid, whose mother was Kelbi, as his successor, but they eventually abandoned Muawiyah's branch of the Umayyad clan for his Marwanid cousins in 684 during the Second Civil War. Marwan's marriage to a Kelbi wife and the presence of an adult son, Abdulaziz, as an heir, potential heir, probably contributes to this Kelbi support for Marwan. But Marwan, of course, is said to have given Abdulaziz only 2nd place in the succession, and he puts Abd al-Malik, whose mother wasn't Kelbi but was Umayyad, as the first heir to the throne after him. And this marks the beginning of a deliberate separation of the Marwanid ruling family from kinship connections with their tribal supporters. Only one of Abd al-Malik's 9 successors had a Kelbi mother. Moreover, after 720, the Umayyad caliphs had Qureshi or Thaqafi mothers, that is, mothers from the top of the Hijazi elite. Or in the very last years of Umayyad rule, they had slave mothers, but that's a unique situation. While marriage links between the ruling Umayyads and the Syrian tribes were increasingly rare, there were other ways of developing and maintaining military support. And this is a strong explanation for the Qusur, the Umayyad castles that are on migration routes and other pathways in the Syrian desert. And these suggest the strenuous efforts that the ruling Umayyad clan made to connect themselves with the tribes of the Syrian desert. You can find a northward drift in these itineraries. So Abd al-Malik's itinerary is marked between Taboria and Damascus in pink, and then Hisham's itinerary between Damascus and Rasafa and points north is marked in blue at each end of the Marwanid period. This reflects both military success against the Roman Empire and the development of alliances with the Arabic-speaking tribes of Mesopotamia and the Armenian Christians of the Caucasus, who become increasingly important in the war with the Romans in the north. And indeed, by the 730s, the new North Mesopotamian and Caucasian frontier region, the so-called Umayyad North, in the words of Alison Vacker, had supplanted the old Kelbi central and southern Syrian frontier. And indeed, competition between the northern tribes and the Kelb contributed to the split within the Umayyad family in the 740s. And this creates the conditions for others to end Umayyad and Syrian imperial power permanently, ushering in the Abbasid era. So this gets us to the third theme that I wanted to talk about, and the final one. These revolts that end the Umayyads point to questions of identity and social change. Umayyad rule only lasts for about 100 years, and if we take out the 20 years of civil war, when the whole empire is contested, then you only have about 80 years of Umayyad rule that's secure. And all the Umayyad rulers are drawn from just 4 successive generations. The last Umayyad Caliph, Marwan II, was born about 30 years after the death of Uthman, the first Umayyad Caliph. And so this is a very short period in historical terms, but it is a bit longer than, well, it is longer than human lifespans. So if we think about the 1920s from now, that's the Umayyad period in our own perspective. And over this century, there are significant changes in culture and identity. At the beginning of the Umayyad period, the Quran had yet to be compiled as a book. There's little evidence of an Arab ethnic identity in the sense that it later acquires, nor is there a clear sense of Islam. Islam as a fully articulated, distinctive religion in the early 7th century. The key work on these questions is by Fred Donner, Ilka Lindstedt, and Peter Webb. In the 7th century, writing had very limited uses for the 7th century Arabians, but by the end of the Umayyad period, most of the main genres of Arabic writing arguably exist by 750. So that there's a huge change in the technology of communication during the Umayyad period. And indeed, the technology of culture and cultural identity. By the end of the Umayyad century, the idea of the Arabs, al-Arab, was well established, even if its referent remained highly contested. Who was an Arab is a big question in the mid-8th century literature. And Islam and Muslims have become commonly used terms by the mid-8th century, for all that the Islamic tradition remained very closely enmeshed with Jewish and Christian culture in this period. And indeed was increasingly influenced by Zoroastrian and other Iranian currents of thought as well. One of the main consequences of the success of Islam and the Arab identity is that it's very, very hard to avoid teleologies in thinking about the Umayyad period. The narrative sources tend to assert the administrative and political unity of the empire, the dominance of Arabs and Arabic, and continuities with the later orthodoxies of Islam. All these things are prevalent in the literary tradition. But none of these things are in fact present in any straightforward way for the whole Umayyad period, which has led to terms like Paleo-Islam from Aziz al-Azmeh, or Fred Donner's Believers movement as a category for 7th century Islam. In the book, I tried Arabian monotheism and the religion of the faithful for the early phase. By the end, the Quran seems to be well established as the preeminent scripture of the Arabian monotheists. But there are also substantial numbers of converts to the same religious identity from people of non-Arabian heritage by the mid-8th century, notably the Berbers and the Khorasanians. There are also many Arabian heritage Muslims who'd ceased to be part of the military elite by the mid-8th century, or who sought to oppose it and replace it. So you have an intra-elite competition. Perhaps you have a Peter Turchin elite overproduction situation in the mid-8th century. And these demographic, ethnic, religious changes are the processes that shape the emergence of the Islamic traditions of the medieval period and indeed guaranteed their long-term survival. Stefan Asders and others have emphasized that Arabian monotheism was a monotheist faith tradition that was used to articulate and perform the unity of a new ethnic and religious military elite. And in that sense, it's not unlike the processes that united the Christian Goths or the Franks or the Angles in Western Europe. Jewish and Christian beliefs and practices had long been widespread in the pre-Islamic Arabian Peninsula, alongside the so-called pagan ones, the local beliefs and practices. And the Quran itself is the best evidence for these points. But external sources also support this assessment. Holger Zelantine and Ilka Lindstedt have recently argued that Muhammad and his followers already saw themselves as descendants of Ishmael, and that Muhammad's revelation of a new law was directed at Arabian non-Christians and non-Jews in particular, with Jews and Christians recognized as co-religionists with different laws. Certainly, there's evidence for the inclusion of Christians in the ranks of the new empire's armies in large numbers. With Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and others managing the conquered territories in the 7th century. And co-option of local elites is really crucial to the Arabian imperial project. The 690s famously are the big turning point in the articulation of a distinctive Islamic imperial ideology. And this shows up across the tradition and across the material culture as a very dramatic horizon. The most famous example, of course, is probably the coinage. Which suddenly changes, well, after some experimental phases that are not so different from Roman or Sasanian models. And these articulations were promoted intensively by the Marwanids and their allies in the context of efforts to assert their legitimate authority against rivals and in the context of escalating war with Rome. And the slogans on the coins do seem to point in both of those directions at once. The generation of the 690s through the 720s is the one where heightened ethnic and religious tensions at the top of the imperial elite can also be perceived in the texts. This is when senior scribes at the center of the empire became Muslim as opposed to Christian or Zoroastrian, and when legislation on tax and conversion began to be promulgated by the Umayyad caliphs. You also have polemical diplomatic exchanges about religion between Umar II and his counterpart Leo III, and these seem to have some basis in real communication between the two empires. Resentment among non-Arabian converts at unequal treatment in tax and pay are another recurrent feature of the sources from this period and after. And those seem to be the key drivers of the rebel movements in North Africa and in Khorasan. These are status anxieties that the Berbers and the Khorasanians, Sogdians, are not treated the same as the Arabian elements in the army. At the same time, members of the Syrian army are increasingly used as enforcers of Umayyad authority in other provinces, and this provokes resentment within the Arabian armies as well. And it's coalitions between non-Arabian fighters and those of Arabian heritage who resented their loss of power and status that created the religio-political formations that overwhelmed the overstretched and divided Umayyad elite in the 740s. Indeed, with hindsight, we can see that the Umayyad project was never going to last. It's very easy with hindsight, right? But they're trying to hold together far too many contradictions. Above all, it's just an enormous space that they're seeking to control. They're trying to dominate it from the highly marginal lands of the Syrian steppe with their political centers in Syria and Mesopotamia, rather than in its wealthiest regions, the fertile lands of southern Iraq, and the commercial and agricultural centers of Khorasan and Sogdia. Moreover, the Umayyads stake almost everything on defeating the Roman Empire. And in this, they had very little choice, probably, since their base was in Syria on the frontier with the Romans. Had the Umayyads defeated the Romans, the contradictions they faced might not have proved comprehensively disastrous for them. But the effectiveness of Roman resistance, the geography of the Mediterranean and the Anatolian highlands contributed directly to their failure and to the crisis that ended their rule. And looking back now from 2026, 1,300 and something years after the Umayyads, it is hard not to see the turmoil of this tipping point in the late antique world system as a warning. Climate change, pandemic, and resentments on the old empire's imperial peripheries combined to drastically reshape the world order, while inequalities, resentments of injustice, and the possibility of becoming the new elite were the driving forces in the repeated waves of unrest in the 7th and 8th centuries. And this unrest meant that while branches of the Umayyad clan were instrumental in establishing the Arabic and Islamic world, they couldn't survive to preside over its future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, it was interesting for me at the beginning of the talk. I lost all my self-confidence as someone who has some ideas about the Umayyads, but by the end, I felt okay. I still it's not completely off. So it was a very, very rich talk and a rich experience, and I will certainly put the link of this recording to my handbooks when it comes to the Umayyads. I will close the recording, and we will start the session of questions and answers.